Okay, thanks very much everybody for coming. I think it's 5 to 4, so we're going to make a start. My name is Ben Goldstein.
And I'm Laura Patsko.
And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself first and then Laura. I work at the New School. I work online as I teach materials writing at the New School in New York on an MA program in TESOL. I also have written various materials, published materials as well. And Laura?
What do I say? I was working for Cambridge up until about Christmas, and now I'm, let's say, semi-retired. Still working with Cambridge, doing lots of traveling and other things too. I've also written some material for teachers, not for students. Most recently, co-authored an ebook on how to write pronunciation activities. Okay, and what we're going to be talking about today is, it's called Just Like Me. We're going to be looking at near peers. Don't worry if you're not familiar with that term. Laura will define it a little bit later on, but I'm not going to begin with a near peer. I'm actually going to begin with someone you might know, a celebrity. How many of you recognize this woman? Maybe if I put this, it might make it a bit easier. How many of you know the series Modern Family? Put your hand up. Okay, that's a relatively good percentage. Gloria is one of the characters in Modern Family. I'm going to show it as an example of the kind of English that you and your students may hear. She's from Colombia. The actress is Sofia Vergara. But in this series, this American series, Modern Family, she plays a Colombian wife, and she has an American native speaker husband. She's obviously a native Colombian speaker. Okay, so remember those questions. So what does Jay notice about Gloria's English? And then how does his reaction to her make her feel? Okay. Just to give you a bit of time to think. But notice, I think, the key point here that she makes when she defends herself, because clearly Jay's reaction to her is quite an aggressive one, yeah? And she says, I know I have an accent, but people understand me just fine. I think that's the key point. And Jay's response to her is, of course, it's not helping her in the slightest, is it? Why is that? What point is he making about her English? What kind of corrections does he make? He kind of picks on very infrequent, very, these kind of expressions like dog eat dog and so on, which are not important and her accent in no way would impede intelligibility. In other words, he's kind of missing the point. He's emphasizing points which clearly in the real world, remember this is fiction, and this isn't Sofia Vergara, this is Gloria. She's in her role as this very Latina, sort of voluptuous wife to Jay, who kind of knows better. It's a rather sexist I think, context. And of course, it's not her, in a way, it's not really Sofia Vergara that makes the mistake, it's the secretary. Because clearly in the real world, there wouldn't be this misunderstanding between baby cheeses and baby Jesus, I don't think. From the context, I think the secretary would know what she wanted to say. In other words, what I think is interesting about this is that this is the kind of English, and funnily enough, this is the kind of role model, possibly, Gloria, is a possible role model for our students. Students are looking at this kind of English online, on Netflix or whatever. And yet it's very important, I think, to emphasize here that this isn't a real person. Yeah? This is a fictionalized character. And so when we move on to talk about the difference between this and what we're going to focus on in this talk is that the people you'll see from now on will be real people, using English in real contexts. But I think it's important to look at this because this is something that learners are going to be exposed to the whole time. So what we're going to be looking at in this talk is the near-peer role model, what it is exactly, and what is the connection with L2 identity as well. And finally, what can we do in the classroom to, let's say, make these concepts practically, how can we apply them practically in the classroom? So we're going to move on to Laura. She's going to explain to you, although you may have an idea, what a near-peer role model is. Thank you. So, moving quickly on, what is a near-peer role model? What are we referring to when we use this term? Well, unsurprisingly, it's a combination of a role model and a peer. If you're with me so far, that's a good sign. And so a near-peer role model is essentially someone who can act as a role model for a learner because they're similar to that learner in one or more ways, typically maybe a similar age or the same gender identification or from the same first language or national background. And also just more generally, maybe they have similar interests or are from a similar kind of social group or in close geographical proximity to this person. You know, they're very relatable. They are not a direct peer in their same social circle, but they are a near peer because of these areas of similarity. Closely related to this is another concept which we're going to come on to, which is the concept of peers as content creators. So essentially, if you have some input from language learners themselves, and also guidance and input and decision-making from the teacher, then you have learner-centered content. So content that is much richer because, again, the learners can relate to it. Either they've created it themselves or it has been created for them by people like themselves, which is a lot more rich and relevant and accessible, arguably, than something that's been created only by a teacher with only the teacher's decisions and doesn't have the learner's own voices in it. Typically what we're talking about when we hear this phrase learner-centered content is something that we do in our own classrooms with the same group of learners, but it doesn't only need to apply to that. It can also relate to content that's been created by near peers outside the classroom and then brought into the classroom, potentially by the teacher or in material itself. So I think this will become clearer if we see a couple of examples. So I'd like to introduce you to a couple of people. This is Allison. And this is Caio. Allison is from Peru, Caio is from Brazil. They are both students, they are real people. They're not characters. That's a beautiful photograph of Allison. I think it might be a professional photograph, but she is genuinely Allison from Peru. She's not a Gloria, she's not a character. This is a real person, just like a student, like many students that I've taught. And the same for Caio. And I'm going to show you an example of content created by them for learners like them. There's a video of each of them, and they're both talking about clothing. But that's all I'll tell you. So you'll watch Allison, then you'll watch Caio, and I just want you to be thinking, what are they saying about clothing? That's their common link, but they're talking about it in slightly different ways. So first, Allison.
Hi, I'm Allison. I usually waste money on clothes that I don't really need when I go to the shopping center. That's why I have my closet full.
Now Caio.
Hi, my name is Caio, and I don't think so that your dress is important in your work. It's important what you do, what you make, what ideas you have, and how you are important for your company. That's that I believe.
So super briefly, 30 seconds with someone near you. What about clothing? What were they saying? Each person's story. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So you'll see that these are just normal people telling normal everyday stories. Allison's got a problem of buying too many clothes, her closet's overflowing. Caio's talking about how clothes relate to your work and whether it's important what you wear or whether it's more important what you do. So,
football shirt to work.
Depending on his job. So what we're getting at here is some of the points that we've looked at before are exemplified by these two real people in the real world who happen also to be learning English. They're similar to many learners that I've taught, certainly, in their age, their interests, their everyday lives. Their language varies from some norms we might expect, but they're clear and effective. We're able to be interested in what they say, not simply how they say it. So a couple of questions for reflection. If you prefer to reflect on your own and think, that's fine. If there's someone near you you'd like to discuss with, that's fine too. We'll give you a little bit longer this time to just think about these questions.
So I think it's possible from what we're hearing that maybe not, that you hadn't heard role models like these in the classroom when you were learning another language, or this is not something which is done very often. But we believe that these, depending on the level, of course, that these, Kayo and Alison, represent interesting models for learners because they're good at different things. If you think about what they are talking about, the same topic, Alison, her intonation is very good. She's very emphatic in that point of view. Kayo is emphatic from the, I don't know if you heard the way he was using the what, these kind of subordinate clauses, the what I think is this, that is what I believe, a good way of sort of summing up. In other words, if a teacher who can pick out these strengths in learners and point out that this one person is good at one thing, clearly kind of guiding the learners to learn from each other, I think can be very beneficial in the classroom. And I think what has happened with English as lingua franca, the arrival of that as a phenomenon, is that we're beginning to see our materials now with L2, second language learners, present. But up until now, most of those speakers have been almost near native speakers. And it seems to me this is an advance, because you're not just hearing L1 speakers, but at the same time, it seems to me to be creating yet another inaccessible model for our learners. And so what we feel is that these, just these little mini texts, these pieces of these short sound bites, with these students just talking about something very everyday, can actually be very beneficial for learners. They can see themselves, perhaps can identify and see these people as accessible role models, having a kind of plausible, accessible goal as well. So moving on then, I think what we're trying to say is that we need to focus on effective communication. This is where a lot of the research that Laura has done on this, particularly looking at these articles. We'll give you the references at the end of the talk. But particularly this idea, as I've just said, the idea of more achievable and realistic role models. This is, I think, a clear plus when looking at this kind of input. Variation, again, seen as a normal part of language and not something to be feared. As I said, both Kayo and Alison express themselves in different ways. They get their message across in different ways, but obviously their English is very different. But that variation is something we should celebrate, not something we should be afraid of. And allowing that variation to come into class is something that again, could be highly beneficial. And again, this idea of showing these learners in class, getting the teacher to actually show examples in class, again, I think will help us prevent this foreign language learning anxiety, this idea of always everyone's looking at me, I'm afraid to speak out in class because my English is flawed. And finally, then, this is all connects with what Zoltan Dunye has, I'm sure some of you are familiar with, his concept of the ideal L2 self, this development, this kind of vision of yourself speaking the second language in the perfect kind of context. And this being very important because of this representing a goal for you. The difference, in other words, the discrepancy between your English now and the English that you could speak if you were in the role of the L2 ideal self is what motivates you to improve. So these are the key, let's say, takeaways from the research angle. And of course, as we said at the beginning, students would not be used to seeing themselves in class, material like that being presented, kind of officially in the classroom. But of course, as we've seen with Gloria at the beginning, there are L2 users everywhere on the internet. And I think these are also very interesting to analyze as role models. We saw Sofia Vergara in the role of Gloria, but compare Gloria perhaps with Sofia Vergara, compare the way that they speak together would be very interesting to do. The other example, I was in Mexico recently and we spoke about Salma Hayek, the fact that, again, she's plurilingual, she's able to speak English Spanish and French fluently. And again, to a Mexican audience, that was extremely interesting for them to see her talking about her ability in these 3 different languages. Of course, these are all many different examples. I'm sure you can think of your own examples, and I'm sure your students are accessing this online very easily. And of course, teachers as well. And Cambridge have just produced this excellent magazine, which you can take away, called The Press. And I'm just going to focus on a couple of articles in this, which I think, which you can take home and read when you have a bit more time. But I will just, on page 8, you'll see an article about, it actually looks different to that. It looks a little bit more fancy now, where Jade Blue, she talks about 2 different role models who motivated her when she was learning German. And it's very, very interesting the way that she analyzes the difference between them, one a native speaker, one a non-native speaker. And I think what's really interesting about it is the way that, again, the non-native speaker was in her position, was therefore more accessible for her. And although she liked talking to both of them and learnt a lot talking to both of these different German speakers, she gained far more from the person who was in her position, her fellow student, than an older native speaker. And it's very interesting take on that. And then again, another article on page 4. Again, I guess a lot of your students are football fans. The Premier League is full of multilingual speakers. And one of the great examples, Petr Cech, who I always get confused, he used to play for my team, Chelsea, but I think he now plays for Arsenal, is that right? Anyway, this is a very interesting interview where he is talking about how English is the lingua franca on the football field, but then how he uses, as he's plurilingual, not quite a polyglot, the kind of polyglot that Scott was talking about in his talk, but he certainly manages these different languages and has these languages at his disposal and is able, depending on the context, depending on who he's talking to, he can switch languages. And I think these are 2 very good, interesting examples of role models, let's say, in the public eye. Yeah? This example of a footballer. And referring to what Scott was saying today in his talk about polyglots, I think it's particularly Jade's case. He mentions that some of the takeaways that he took were from analysing those polyglots was this idea of having achievable goals, finding a conversational partner, and visualising your L2 self. And those 3 things are exactly what she describes in this article about learning German. So it's interesting to see that overlap there. It's the plausibility, the accessibility of learning from your peers that comes through very strongly. So I do encourage you to have a look at this magazine later on. Moving on, what can we do in the classroom? Let's move back to Laura.
Thank you. Can I have a clicker too, please? Thanks. I'm going to ask you to read your newspaper later, please. Materials down. So we're just going to finish by looking at the practical side of using near-peer role models, whether in video form or some other form, in your classroom. First with some general good practice, kind of top tips, things to remember if you're going to use these effectively. First of all is that learners themselves need to understand the principles. We here are all very engaged and very motivated in what we do and spend countless hours, paid and unpaid, thinking about what to do for our students to give them the best possible learning experience. And it's one thing for us to understand the benefits of near peers as a role model for learners. The learners themselves also need to be part of that discussion and to understand what it is to have a role model. What are they going for? What is their actual goal and how will they get there? And can this particular near peer tell them anything, whether literally or just through their experience? Can they tell them anything about that learning process that's going to make it feel more achievable, more relevant, more enjoyable? So the learners themselves need to understand the principles of near peers as role models and why they're using or creating this kind of content. The examples that we showed you were videos, but you can use other kinds of media as well to represent text, let's say, for learners. So it could be audio recordings as well as video recordings, or also written texts. Whether that's something you do within your own classroom, so students prepare visual or audio or written texts for each other, or whether you bring in examples from outside the classroom, like the ones that we've shown you. And again, there are many examples online that can be found, particularly of people in the public eye who represent good examples of successful international users of English. Thank you. You also need to be realistic and manage expectations, both your own and your students'. So bear in mind that students producing videos on their phones of themselves talking are clearly not the same as studio-produced professional content, but that's okay. That's part of the experience of doing this, is recognizing that we're talking about people and not always categorizing them into learner, teacher, native, non-native, but just people. People with stories and experiences to share, and that learners of English can learn a lot from fellow users of English. Specifically, in terms of materials and activities, I'll give you a couple of examples of material and activity types, just to make this a little bit more concrete. So, conversations between peers, near-peer dialogues, for example, that can be recorded and viewed by other students. This gives your learners the opportunity to see and hear their peers using English. Okay? So making it just very tangible, very real, not just a theory. It also doesn't have to be completely free of what we might call mistakes. It's real English use, and when people speak spontaneously, whatever their first language, they don't always follow exact standards and patterns and so on. So again, it's about showing people using English in different settings, making it very real. You can also highlight positive experiences that near peers have had. I think we often put a lot of emphasis on how difficult it is to learn a second language, and yes, that's true, but it's not all bad. So helping learners see tips and strategies that they can use to improve their learning experience, as shared by other people who have had that experience, can be hugely motivating. And related to this is a concept of language learning histories. These are essentially written or recorded accounts of other learners' experiences of learning a language, which can then be provided to other learners of the same language. They may not always be positive. They may also include examples of challenges and solutions that they found to those challenges, and also choices that they made, so how they've directed their own learning. But a kind of history or a narrative where they share their successes and any obstacles they've had and how they've overcome them. So again, it's all about making it relatable and real and accessible. I think ultimately what we're talking about is trying to create an environment in which learners can really grow and can really see themselves as capable of that growth, with realistic goals and role models that inspire them. And the research suggests that if we can do that successfully, then we can truly make a difference to that journey of language learning. Thank you very much. If we have any remaining minutes, we can take a couple questions.
We've got 3 minutes for any questions. Is it? Okay, well, 2 minutes. Yeah, you might need the mic.
It's just that this has been a huge topic of discussion on Braille, which is a Facebook community for Brazilian teachers, because Brazilians like pointing out mistakes on especially pronunciation of major Brazilian celebrities. So they have that, even if they make more mistakes than the celebrity, they consider it a great shame that the Brazilian doesn't speak English with whatever they consider a flawless accent. So how to deal with that kind of myth?
Thank you. Right, nice to see you. I can't get the other microphone working, so I'm just going to run back and forth here, unless you know how to make it work. I think not only Brazilians, learners and teachers everywhere, it's the stuff of learning is making mistakes and these little failures and noticing, oh, that went a bit wrong, ooh, okay, we'll try it this way. I think really the emphasis needs to be on how things are similar or different, and not constantly on whether they're right or wrong. Because just because something was non-standard, and therefore we call it a mistake, doesn't mean that things break down, that they don't work, that they're not communicative, and so on. So I think we're just talking about an attitude
And we'll never get away entirely from people in a learning environment trying to make sure they've got it exactly right and focusing on mistakes. But I think we might need to shift to more of a concept of just, like I say, similarity or difference. Okay, that's not how I would say it, but I understood it. How about you? That kind of thing.
I think to accentuate the positive a little bit, I mean, it's sad that they point out these negative examples, you know, of politicians who can't string a sentence together or whatever. I think it's important perhaps to show, I saw a really interesting workshop not long ago where we were analysing, you know, different footballers' interviews on YouTube, for example. Someone like Fernando Torres, a Spanish footballer who played in the Premier League, to show him when he arrived in Britain could hardly, you know, string a sentence together, literally, you know. And then to show him sort of months later, years later, being a fluent speaker and show these celebrities in that light as language learners and emphasize that aspect of them rather than their celebrity aspect. And that really is I think it comes as quite revealing for students to see that side of things. They don't expect that. Okay, we don't have any time for any more, but yes. Yeah, Phil will be here during the conference if you want to ask any questions to us. And I hope you enjoy reading this. It's full of really interesting material. So I encourage you to flick through that, all related to what we've been talking about today. Thanks very much.